For millennia, human beings have wondered at their own existence and have sought to find a meaning to their lives. Answers came from priests and prophets, from mythologies and theologies. Now powerful answers and new questions have been provided by mathematics and science. In these programs, I shall be talking to physicist and author Paul Davies about the mysteries that have filled people with fascination and dread since the dawn of history. Paul Davies, we've 6 programs in which to discuss such minor matters as the origins of life, whether God plays dice with the universe, and whether we're alone in that universe. But before we tackle them, I want you to defend science from its critics, and there are a great many of them. We look back on a century of scientific triumph, triumphalism, hubris. The atom has been split, we've bounced on the moon, our technologies are nibbling at the edge of space, we've discovered the double helix of the DNA, and yet voices are raised against science from left, from right, from feminists, from theologians, from the New Age. Let's look at some of the criticisms and see whether they're justified. One of the most common is that science is guilty of the sin of reductionism. What is that sin?
If you're faced with a complicated problem, it's very tempting to chop it up into a lot of simple problems and knock them off one by one, and then to say if you've solved all the simple problems, you've solved the whole thing. That's reductionism in a nutshell, and it works extremely well. In my discipline, which is physics, it's had some amazing successes. Look at the world about us. Just see how complicated it is, the richness and diversity of nature. How are we ever to come to understand it? Well, a good way to start is by breaking it up into small, bite-sized pieces. The belief that the entire universe is made up of atoms or some sort of fundamental particles, and that everything that happens in nature is just the rearrangement of these particles, has been extraordinarily fruitful, because once you focus down to the level of individual atoms, you can work out all the laws and principles that govern them. We can figure out what they're doing. And so it's then tempting to believe that if you understand the individual atoms and the way they interact, you understand everything. But of course it's a fallacy. It's often called the fallacy of nothing buttery, to say that the world is nothing but a collection of atoms or subatomic particles interacting with each other. Just ain't true, because so many of the qualities of the world around us, and I'm not just talking about things like life, I'm talking about something as basic as the wetness of water, just can't be understood at the atomic level. You have to take into account the collective and organizational aspects of matter to get the whole picture. But there is this great temptation, because reductionism works so well, because you get quick and easy answers coming back, to believe it is the whole story. Now, physics, I might say, has cured itself, I think, of this reductionistic slant in the 20th century. It's gone beyond reductionism, which worked so well, I think, in the 19th century, and there are aspects of physics now, things to do with lasers and collective properties of large numbers of particles and so on, we don't need to go into it, where you simply can't get by with looking at the individual entities out of which things are built. But biology is going through this very reductionistic phase. And the same thing is true in biology. You've got something as complicated as a living organism. How can you understand it? Well, you look at its cells. How can you understand the cells? Still immensely complex. You look at the molecules. You get quick answers, enormously impressive advances. And it's very beguiling to suppose that that is the whole story. Life is nothing but a collection of
lay critic of science often uses reductionism differently. It is to condemn science in its totality for taking, if you like, the ghost out of the machine.
That's demystification, you see. And I think there's a difference between reductionism and demystification. It's the job of the scientist to explain the world. Now, the world is mysterious when you start out. If you explain it, you've demystified it. Some people think that that somehow diminishes it, that they like the romance of the mystery. I think this is undoubtedly true, that most people would like something left alone. A lot of people say, for example, we don't want to know how life began. We don't want to know the nature of consciousness. We don't want to know how the universe came into existence, because somehow, if these things are explained, they're explained away. There again is this confusion between explaining something and explaining it away, as if because we can write down a set of equations or set of principles that tells us how it happened, somehow we've lost something. there's some quality that's gone out of it. A little bit like if we take life as being something which is so important to us. I'm living, you're living, we're surrounded by living things. We feel that the quality of being alive is such an important thing. And yet, supposing biologists tell us that living organisms are nothing but collections of molecules interacting in complicated ways, have we sapped the essence of life out? Have we exorcised the ghost from the machine? And does that in some way diminish us and the world about us? Well, I don't think so. I think that is simply a false way of looking at science. Science increases the wonder because not only does it explain the world, but it shows us just how truly remarkable it really is. And it's much better to expose it to the spotlight of knowledge and see its wonder, its ingenuity, its complexity,
I must say
to
that
hide in the corners of ignorance.
I've always found that science, in fact, increases one's sense of awe of the numinous. Let's look at another criticism, and that is that science is essentially patriarchal, the feminist criticism.
I've got a lot of sympathy with women who say that science is dominated by men. It is. Frankly, most famous scientists are dead white males. One only needs to think of Newton and Galileo and Darwin and so on. But you mustn't confuse scientists with science. Science itself belongs to everybody. It just happens, for reasons of historical accident, that European men invented science and have dominated it for the last 300 years. That's increasingly changing, though I admit it's still very difficult to get women to come into science. The problem seems to be not so much that women in science are discriminated against, but that young girls just don't seem to be interested in science in the way we would like. So certainly there is a problem there, and I think feminists have correctly identified that there is an educational problem, a sociological, a professional problem. But it's not the problem with the science itself. You can make the same criticism of mathematics, after all. You could say most famous mathematicians are dead white males. Pythagoras was a Greek, but that doesn't mean that there's anything suspect about Pythagoras' theorem. Pythagoras' theorem is true whoever discovers it, and it's there for everybody to use. It's pan-cultural. So mathematics is also in this category, but I don't think anybody would argue that mathematics is culturally relative or is some sort of male conspiracy. I mean, Pythagoras' theorem is simply true, and any woman can prove it to her satisfaction.
But also, of course, there's criticism that science is culturally biased. There are many ethnic groups that would argue that science is very much dominated by Western European traditions.
Look, you're quite right that, of course, science came out of Western Europe, and many of its, let's say, the worldview of the scientist undeniably draws upon the European tradition. In fact, if you look back at how science originated, it was the twin pillars of Greek philosophy, with its emphasis on human beings being able to come to understand their world through the use of rational reasoning, and Judaism, Christianity and Islam, the monotheistic religions, with their emphasis on a created world that is ordered by a designer in a rational and intelligible way. Those were the influences that gave rise to science. This didn't happen in any other part of the world. So if you look, for example, at the time of Newton, look at the situation in China, technology was much more advanced in China at that time than in Europe. But they didn't understand the principles on which the technology was based. It was a sort of trial and error, suck it and see type of basis. Whereas what happened in Europe was that the early scientists began to understand how nature works and began to design technology according to the principles that they had discovered. It's a matter of historical fact that came out of Europe. Now, that doesn't mean that somehow, because science is a product of European culture, therefore it is culturally relative, that it is only relevant to the European mind or something. Well, it's there for everybody, because the Chinese can use the same science now, and they do, and it works.
Let's imagine that, and later we will be discussing whether or not life exists in other nooks and crannies of the universe. Let's imagine we come upon a group of scientists practicing on Mars, to our general astonishment. Will their science be the same as your science? Would the science hypothetically practiced in the farthest flung corner of the Milky Way necessarily be the same science as ours?
Yes, it will. Look, there are two questions here. One is, might this hypothetical group of aliens be interested in different things? They might be doing the science of things that just don't interest us. But to the extent that they're doing the same things, then they will find the same laws. Look, the inverse square law of gravitation that Newton discovered, that is simply a fact of nature, and that fact will be discovered by physicists on Mars or the Andromeda Galaxy or whatever.
And yet there do seem to be suggestions that there are at least ethnic variabilities regarding one's ability in science. Now,
but I think it's total nonsense, you see. There are
hang on.
variabilities...
We recognise that the Chinese, for example, are doing wonderfully in physics.
Yes.
The Japanese are not.
But look, you must distinguish between the science and the practitioners. Look at the way that the Jews from Europe dominated physics for 50 years. Must be something about the education system, the culture. Don't know what it is, so it's interesting to speculate. We can all recognise that certain groups, and now one tends to think of the Chinese and physics, and in other disciplines I'm sure there are other groups that tend to dominate it. That there may well be cultural reasons why people in those ethnic groups go into certain disciplines and are good at them, but that doesn't mean that it's only good for their culture. The whole point is that science belongs to everybody. It's pan-cultural, and if a particular ethnic group makes certain discoveries, we can check those discoveries out, and we will agree. I mean, that's the essence of science, that it's in the public domain, everybody can agree on it. It is objective knowledge. It's the most reliable type of knowledge we have.
Okay,
that's why
you raise the issue of its reliability. Another criticism frequently made, not very eloquently expressed, suggests that science is simply another way of looking at what we call reality,
right,
and by no means the superior way. Now, you would argue, of course, that science is the ultimate, the most reliable method.
The significant thing about science and the scientific method is it leads us to discover things we would never find out in any other way. Let me give you an example. Neutrinos are subatomic particles which we would never ever notice in daily life because they're so elusive. In fact, your average neutrino will go through about 50 light years of solid lead without being stopped. You need very sophisticated scientific instrumentation to discover these things, and yet they're everywhere. It turns out that neutrinos are easily the most common objects in the universe. There are about 1 billion neutrinos for every other type of particle that exists in the universe. If you glance at the sun, in 1 second, more neutrinos pass through the pupil of your eye than there are people on this planet. So they're going through us the whole time, trillions and trillions of neutrinos, and we just don't notice it. In fact, the entire universe is a sea of neutrinos, and ordinary matter of the sort that you and I are made of are just tiny impurities in this vast ocean of neutrinos. Now, you might think neutrinos are of no significance if they're so elusive, but it turns out that they have an important role to play in life. Life as we know it is based on the element carbon, and carbon wasn't present in the early universe after the Big Bang. It's been manufactured inside stars. And if it wasn't for neutrinos, the carbon would still be in those stars. It turns out that some heavy stars explode because of the processes that involve neutrinos in their cores. And it's the explosion of these stars that spreads the carbon around the galaxy and allows it to become incorporated into a new generation of stars and planets and ultimately into a biosphere. So neutrinos really do matter. And yet if it wasn't for science, we would never ever know they're there.
Another criticism that is made of science is that it has introduced megadeath and overkill to the human vocabulary. We look back on a century of 160 million dead in wars, and a lot of this is attributed to the contributions of science, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and perhaps the fact that we've been having the Third World War in installments. To what extent is science guilty?
Science is knowledge, and knowledge is power, and power can be used for good or evil. It's entirely in the hands of the people that use the fruits of science. Now, if you look back at the horrors of the 20th century, things like weapons of mass destruction, pollution and so on, of course, these things have been exacerbated by the fruits of science. We can now do the horrible things that people were doing a long time ago, but on a grander scale. But I like to take the example of fire. Something like fire can be used for good or evil, and it's something we all take for granted in the world today. And the same principles apply, I think, to modern technology. And it's for society as a whole to decide how scientific developments are to be used.
Look, that's wonderful that you're describing a splendid vision of democracy. But in this voting system, the scientist's vote counts for more. The scientist gets a bigger vote.
Well, I don't think scientists get a bigger vote. In fact, I think a lot of people feel that the scientists should be kept out of the debate altogether. In other words, that the emphasis seems to be on restricting what scientists might do and the capabilities scientists might give us, rather than involving the scientists in the discussion about what is good and bad.
Paul, you argue, and no one can dispute it, that science is the most powerful tool available to us. But are there others of quality?
I don't think science is terribly good at telling us about things like ethics, about choices we have to make in society of a social or political nature. In fact, people often ask me at public lectures and things, you're a physicist, you know all about forces in the universe. What about forces for good and forces for evil? And I usually say, well, you don't go to a physicist to ask about good and evil. I have my opinions on what's right and wrong, but they're no better or worse than yours.
But, Paul, people do go to physicists increasingly for comments on good and evil. And in fact, another criticism of science is that the physicist has become, in more than one sense of the term, the new priest.
Yes, I think so, because people are awed by the power of science, and I think physics is the preeminent in this respect, but increasingly biology is catching up. They're awed by the power of science to explain the world, and by the way in which the frontiers of science are probing those age-old questions of existence, like how did the universe begin, how did life begin, the nature of consciousness, how will it all end, and so on. Areas that were exclusively the province of religion and philosophy in the past, and now science is tangling with them, and scientists do seem to be coming up with answers. So they sort of get the impression that scientists know about everything.
I'm glad you're sceptical, because the other great criticism that's made of science is of its hubris. And there's been a lot of, I think, glib talk in recent years that at any moment now someone at Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Oxford, wherever, is going to jot up on a blackboard an equation which will be the theory of everything. Now, this sort of arrogance does seem to be producing hostility.
Well, you see, I don't have any difficulty with that. I think there might be a theory of everything, but we come back to this point. It's a reductionistic theory of everything. It's not the whole story. It may well be that we can identify these basic units, these fundamental entities, whether they're particles or little loops of string or something else we haven't thought of at all yet. But if there are these basic entities underlying everything, and if there's a simple set of laws that connect them, and I hope and expect that there are, we might well be able to write down some mathematical formula that would capture all of reality at that basic level, at that essential fundamental level. But it would be wrong to suppose that that's everything that there is, because it wouldn't tell you why you choose coffee rather than tea to drink in the afternoon, for example.
Another thing which makes science look suspiciously like a religion is the attitude to it of people like me. I've spent years talking to you on various topics, and I grope to understand. But I accept as an article of faith, me, an atheist, that science is getting it right. Now, this makes me very little different from someone who wandered into a vast 14th, 15th century cathedral and believed what was being said from the pulpit. Do you recognise that this is a problem?
It certainly is a problem, because scientists are treated like high priests of some latter-day religion. They do tend to dispose. Now, of course, what I'm saying is that scientific knowledge is reliable knowledge, and it can be tested, and it puts itself up for falsification. That makes it different from religion. It's not a matter of just taking on faith the pronouncement of some particular scientist. They know that there's a scientific community who would just love to prove that particular science is wrong. There are people testing Einstein's theory of relativity the whole time, testing it at the fundamental level, trying to find something wrong with it. And that is a very healthy state of affairs. That's the whole point of doing science. You come up with a theory, everyone tries to shoot it down. If they fail to shoot it down, then we think that your theory is very, very reliable. But it's always in that skeptical atmosphere, because nobody says that you have declared the last word.
Another interesting thing is that science arguably began with priests, and then, of course, two parallel explorations of reality persisted for centuries. There are now, it would seem, the possibility of convergence, and you embody this to some extent. You're the winner of the Templeton Prize, a scientist given an award for his contribution to theology. Do you see science and religion as converging?
You're quite right that theology was the midwife of science. Again, this is a matter of historical fact. And that's no surprise, because the Christian religion, which dominated Europe in the 17th century, had, of course, a long tradition of scholarly theology, of people like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and so on, thinking in a very rational and rigorous way about existence, about nature, about order in nature, about creation, and about God and God's qualities and so on. And so they'd set out a sort of systematic theology, much like the Greeks set out a systematic geometry. So from this tradition, we had people like Newton and Kepler applying those sorts of principles and that type of reasoning to the natural world and making all sorts of discoveries. So it grew out of that way of thinking about the world. It's essential that you believe that there is a law-like order in nature. Otherwise, you couldn't be a scientist if you didn't accept this particular view of the world. You simply couldn't do science if you didn't think it was both ordered in a law-like way and intelligible to us. That's essentially a theological position. So I find it no surprise that now science has matured, and we've had 300 or 400 years of it, and that it has begun to engage in a very serious way those ancient questions, like the ultimate origin of things, and is getting answers. It's no surprise that it is rediscovering, if you like, its theological roots, and that people who have been drawn to ask those theological questions are turning to scientists for the answers. So I find this a very natural convergence. But there is also a somewhat artificial bringing together, I think, of these two strands. I think where it is inappropriate is where this or that religious group start out by already deciding what they believe and then plunder science to bolster those beliefs. The whole point about science is it takes place in a spirit of openness. You may think, wouldn't it be nice if this were the case or that were the case, but you have to be totally open-minded and accept the fact that if the evidence is different, you should change your mind. So it's no good saying, well, I already know that God did this and God did that and the world was created in 7 days or something. I'm going to find something in science that will support that. The whole idea is you see what the science tells you and draw your conclusions from it. You mustn't go backwards.
We leave, as we said at the beginning, a century of scientific triumph. We also leave a century which is bedeviled with what Isaac Asimov would describe as the armies of the night. We see the rise of fundamentalism in all the major religious groupings. We see the nonsense of the New Age. We see an upsurge in medieval superstitions. How can this happen? How can we have these parallel universes?
Yes, I sometimes wonder what it is about the late 20th century that has given rise to all these sort of fringe beliefs and fringe elements. I get deluged with manuscripts from people who are very happy to quote this or that law of physics in supporting their idea of a perpetual motion machine or something. And when you say, well, that contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, well, they don't like that law, but they'll have, the law of conservation of energy. That's okay. And so there is this feeling that scientific knowledge, this huge corpus, is like a miraculous jar. You can dip into it and pull out the bits you like. I have a feeling that, that the scientific worldview is struggling. It's losing the battle against the forces of irrationalism. I'm terribly concerned we're going to be returned to a new dark age of ignorance and superstition.
Well, we've got 5 episodes in which we can fight the battle and hopefully win for science. And in our next exciting edition, we look at the origins of life.